everyone. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Lauren Potechin, and I am a data and analytics consultant at Thorogood. If you don't know us, Thorogood is an independent data and analytics consultancy with a focus on data science, data engineering, and data visualization. Our business focuses on using data to meet our clients' needs, so we're often thinking about how to best leverage data to meet business objectives. In today's video, I'll be talking about 4 tips on using data to collect your carbon emissions. So let's get right into it. The first thing you might want to do when calculating your carbon emissions is to break them down by scope. If you're not familiar with this term, scopes are a way of categorizing business emissions. Scope 1 includes direct emissions from entities owned by an organization. So, for example, emissions from furnaces in a manufacturing plant or from the trucks used in shipping a product. Scope 1 is going to be much more relevant for companies that create a physical product than for companies who provide services or non-tangible products. Organizations in industries like financial services or software may have very little or even zero Scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 emissions are classified as indirect emissions from energy usage. So these emissions will be from activities like electricity used in office buildings. Lastly, Scope 3 emissions are the broadest scope. They are defined as all other indirect emissions. As you can see from this infographic from the EPA, Scope 3 will include emissions from things like business travel, commuting, and the usage of the end product. The scopes are a good way to organize your emissions calculations. With large businesses, it's easy to get overwhelmed with listing out the activities and products that generate emissions. Breaking it down into scopes will make the task much less daunting and will likely also be more helpful in end-of-year reporting or in achieving carbon neutral certifications. The next thing that might help you calculate your carbon emissions is to break them down by country. This one's important because the operations in each country likely differs. For example, you might have more office buildings in some countries versus others. Or your manufacturing plants in one country produce different products than the manufacturing plants in another. The differences in business operations across countries will create differences in the amount of emissions each country produces. Additionally, it's likely that the conversion rates used to calculate emissions for things like energy use will differ by country. For example, a country like India uses a lot of coal to produce energy for electricity, while countries like Brazil use a lot of hydropower for their energy. Because of that, using the same amount of electricity in Brazil and India, let's say to power an office building, will result in higher emissions in India than in Brazil because the coal-powered energy is a lot more carbon expensive than the hydro-powered energy. So breaking down your calculations by country will not only help with organization, but will also provide a more accurate picture of your emissions than just using one conversion rate for your global operations. And then this next tip will be pretty important in finding your total emissions number. As we've discussed, emissions are generated from pretty much every activity in your business's operations. So it would be almost impossible to put a sensor and measure each activity, like an employee's commute or the end user's use of your product. Therefore, you have to make decisions on what to calculate and what to estimate. To get the most accurate picture of your emissions, try to collect as much data as you can for activities that you can measure. For example, energy usage at office buildings or manufacturing plants can be calculated using electricity and water bills with a conversion factor. Make sure to use conversion factors from trusted sources like the EPA or other trusted organizations. Use your measurements to reflect as many activities as you can, and then create a model to estimate the rest. For example, you may not be able to directly measure the emissions caused by the business travel of your employees or their commute. For business travel, you can make assumptions for how often and how far your employees are traveling on average and by which ways of transportation. And then using those assumptions and a conversion factor, you can model the amount of emissions for those activities. And then you could also use a mix between modeling and measuring for activities like commuting. As an example, you can take an employee survey to see how your employees get to work. Maybe some work remotely, some walk, some drive in, some might drive in, but in electric cars. Your survey will give you an idea of the distribution of the different methods of commuting, and you can use assumptions and modeling to work out the emissions for each of those ways of commuting to find a total emissions number. There's no correct way to decide what to measure and what to model. Just make sure that you're making reasonable assumptions to get the most accurate calculation of your emissions. And then this last tip is something that will play a much larger role now than it may have a few years ago. Right now, you may have a lot more employees working completely remotely, or maybe you have a permanently hybrid way of working. Either way, you should factor this into the calculation of your emissions. But the emissions that come from working from home are a lot trickier to estimate. It's easy to see your office's electricity and water bills, but not so easy to see the electricity generated at the homes of your remote employees. And even then, it's even more difficult to discern the amount of electricity that was used because of work rather than for personal use. This is a great case for building a model. A model can be used to estimate how working from home impacts emissions and can lead to interesting analyses on if in-person working is more carbon expensive, and even further can lead to action items like how to make one way of working more sustainable. And that is all we have today. Thank you for listening, and please reach out if you have any questions.